Welcome to the World of Rare Disease, a show that focuses on awareness and education about rare and complex disorders. Today's show features RNA board member John Campbell and organization volunteer Lisa Deck, who will be discussing the drug development process and the role of pharmaceutical companies and patient advocacy groups. Today's show will include a dialogue with Rare New England board member John Campbell. John is currently a clinical development director at a major pharmaceutical company and has 25 years industry experience in the pharmaceutical industry. John currently leads a team conducting global clinical trials in rare liver disease. Today, John will discuss his experience interacting with patient advocacy groups while working in the pharmaceutical industry. According to the Every Life Foundation, 95% of rare diseases do not have a single FDA-approved drug treatment. Pharmaceutical companies are the innovators of potentially life-saving research and drug development. We will learn about the roles and types of pharmaceutical companies that exist, what companies can do for patients and patient advocacy groups, and seek to understand the regulatory implications for these companies and the rare disease community. This is part one of our discussion with John. Part two of the show will dive deeper into how drugs get to market, clinical trials, and what that means for the rare disease patient. Welcome, John. Thanks for being here today. I'd like to get started and ask, what types of pharma companies are there and how are they structured?
Well, that's a good question. It's a big question, and I think we could divide them along size, if you like. Many people have heard the term big pharma, and big pharma are your GlaxoSmithKlines, your Mercks, those types of companies. And then there's smaller companies such as that might not have drugs that are marketed yet. All of the big companies will have many drugs marketed in different therapeutic areas. And this makes a difference in the drug development process because big companies with lots of products that are currently being marketed, they have a lot to lose, if you will. So there's a lot to protect. And there's a lot of caution and conservatism. In a smaller company, biotech or pharma, you might have more, there might be only one drug in development, so that can lead to sort of a more focus on that singular drug and more aggressive drug development.
Wonderful. So it sounds as though there's many different levels of pharmaceutical companies. And I know this, again, is a broad question, but we're just trying to understand here. What is the best way about bringing a new drug to market? How does that work, in particular, the drugs for rare disease patients?
Yeah, so I think the number one thing to say to that question is that it takes time, and it takes a long time. The average time is 10 to 15 years. From start to approval, and it takes anywhere from, say, $1.2 to $2.5 billion to do so for a big pharma. That can vary a lot depending on the drug and the disease that it's trying to treat. In rare disease, typically one of the big differences is you don't have a lot of history to guide you through the clinical trial drug development process. And sometimes, that leads to making some educated guesses with respect to design. Another big difference is that there's a lot less patients. So your trials might be smaller, and depending on the nature of the disease, whether it be life-threatening, this can impact sort of the size of the trials. So in rare diseases or a common disease, the need to demonstrate to the regulatory bodies in the US, the FDA, the wording is you need to demonstrate substantial evidence of efficacy and safety in order to gain approval. And whether it's a rare disease or a common disease, that is the same. Frequently in a rare disease situation, because of the unique characteristics and the less available patients with the disease, and typically there's no other medicine on the market, There is some flexibility with respect to some of the more standard elements of a clinical trial that you are permitted with respect to the regulatory agencies.
Wonderful. So when you're talking about regulation and kind of bringing these drugs to market, I think we have to take a look at the pharmaceutical companies and the different roles that exist within them and how do they interact with each other. Again, it's a big question, but how can you break that down to explain that to an everyday person?
Yeah. So there are a lot of roles within a pharmaceutical company. And if we take big pharma for the sake of this discussion, you can divide it into two really big buckets. The commercial side and the research side. And there's some big differences between those two big buckets. Within each one of those buckets, of course, there's hundreds of roles. But commercial generally is involved when the drug has been approved for marketing, and there's a sales component to that, as well as a marketing component to that. And then on the research side, of course, there's many different roles that mirror sort of the development of the drug process as it is developed, from discovery, bench research, all the way through to clinical trials, your regulatory folks, and medical affairs, for example. So there's a lot of roles, and they work in concert. And there are some very distinct regulations that govern, particularly the commercial side, to avoid what we call conflict of interest, and to make sure that the claims that are being communicated to either the prescribers or direct to consumer, to the patient, are substantiated with evidence, sufficient evidence, so that everything is squared away.
Right. So occasionally we do hear that the reputation of pharma is that they are biased and all about the money, not the patient. Do you have a response to that?
Yes, I do, actually. It is a frustrating thing that we do hear occasionally. And I think, in the past there has been some issues with the way pharmaceutical companies in general have conducted their business. In my experience, they're very few and far between. And I don't think that individual infractions or things that are very highly publicized should reflect on the pharmaceutical industry in general. I work within an R&D organization of a large pharmaceutical company, and a lot of us are scientists there, and we're dedicated to bringing these medicines to patients, and it's a very long road to get there that requires a lot of effort, sometimes a lot of disappointments. And pharmaceutical companies deal with these regulations from the FDA, for instance, but also legal risks as you go along. So we do hear this, Lisa, for sure, but I think it's not something that the patients should really feel is reflective of pharmaceutical companies in general.
Right. And I'm just asking the question, don't shoot the messenger. I am a patient as well, and I know that I hear a lot about pharmaceutical companies and working with patients and patient advocacy groups. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what some ways they can work together are?
Sure, and I think it's a good question. And pharmaceutical companies are just one player in the drug development process. There are many other players, such as the FDA in the United States, as well as the providers, the investigators, and most importantly, the patients. So it takes all of these players. Sometimes we say it takes a village to successfully develop a drug. And I've seen in the last 5 years or even longer than that, that the focus on the patient is increasing. So the interaction between the pharmaceutical companies who are trying to develop a drug that provides relief for a certain disease, they need to know, what the most bothersome aspects of that disease are. And the best way to understand that is from the patient. And patient advocacy groups are there for the patient, and they are a source of information for pharmaceutical companies to consider as they design their programs and run clinical trials to test the efficacy and safety of drugs. Pharmaceutical companies also can provide some grants occasionally to patient advocacy groups. That's a highly regulated endeavor, but I think the point I'd like to make is that it's really a two-way street, and this way, working together with the providers, with the investigators, with the pharma companies, and the patients is the best way to develop drugs that are safe and effective and are clinically meaningful to the patient.
Right. It's very interesting because I feel like that has come about more and more in the more recent years, the patient having a voice too. And I think it's really a neat partnership that you can see happening between pharmaceutical companies and patients and patient advocacy groups. And it sounds like being a part of the pharmaceutical company is much more than many people think. There are lives that are affected, so I imagine there are highs and lows. It's really been enlightening to hear about your passion and expertise, and I'm sure there might be something that I forgot about. So I was wondering, is there anything else you want to mention before we close up about pharmaceutical companies and their roles and how working with patient advocacy groups? Do you have any additional comments you might want to mention?
I think what we talked about as far as the focus on the patient is important, and I'd like folks to know that pharmaceutical companies are focused on the patient. And the way a lot of us look at it is that if we provide medicines that provide meaningful relief to patients, particularly patients where there is no current medicine, this is what drives us, and it is motivating. And as time goes on and the patient perspective becomes greater, it really is motivating, I think, for folks within the entire spectrum of pharmaceutical company employees and as in the industry as a whole. So I think we're going to see more of that, and we're going to see more of collaborations with academic institutions, and this will all benefit the ability to provide medicines that are that really meet an unmet need.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. RNA and Motion. As we get to the end of our show, it's time for our segment called RNA and Motion. Before closing each show, we provide our viewers with an opportunity to share comments and ask questions. During each show, we will read the questions sent in to us from previous shows and provide answers. Today, we have a question from Lori. Lori comments about our last program called Depression and Anxiety in Rare and Complex Diseases. Lori says, "Thank you for this incredibly validating interview. I have a rare disease plus multiple sclerosis. Both of these diagnostic journeys include periods where I simply stopped trying to get help because I was so wary of having my issues dismissed as not real or told that they must be due to stress. I was wary of dealing with doctors who simply weren't up for a complicated problem, and your speakers were dead right. It was emotionally traumatic. I do understand that not everyone is up for something complicated, but it would have been so much better if the doctors I were consulting told me that they knew something was going on and believed that there was a problem. But this was over their head, rather than gaslighting over my own experience. I don't mind if they say, I don't know what's going on. What I do mind is there's nothing going on. And Rare New England's answer says, thank you, Lori, for sharing your experience and perspective. Most often we hear from patients and families that validating their symptoms goes a long way, even when a clinician doesn't understand what's going on. This holds true for family members and friends as well. Patients feel supported and comforted when their loved ones acknowledge their symptoms and hurdles. Thank you, Lori, for sending in the question. We'd like to invite you to submit more questions and answers from today's show. We will answer them during our next RNA and Motion segment on our next show. Please send us your questions or comments to info@rarenewengland.org. We will share your responses on our next show. That is it for today's show. Thank you, John, for being here.
Thank you.
Please let us know your comments about the show or email us with any questions you have. You can email us at the address on the screen and we will respond during the next show. From all of us here at Rare New England and all the patients and families who keep rare disease in motion, thank you for watching. And remember, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses and zebras.